everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another Climate Live K12 session for students, educators, and the public. So this series is brought to you by the Columbia Climate School. My name is Laurel Zaimashihi, and I'm going to be facilitating the session today. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Columbia Climate School or are joining us for the first time, the Columbia Climate School is a newly established school at Columbia University for transdisciplinary climate research. The school marshals the university's strength in basic and applied disciplines, and it expands the resources to understand climate and its impact on society, developing and inspiring knowledge-based solutions, and educating future leaders for a just and prosperous society on a healthy planet. So the school is the first one at Columbia in over 25 years, and it incorporates more than 20 different centers and thousands of people who collaborate among many different departments at the university. And through this, we are able to better connect, amplify, and advance new areas of climate inquiry, research, impact across Columbia and beyond. So with these Climate Live K12 sessions, we're hoping to introduce you all to the interdisciplinary work through our scientific experts. These are monthly sessions. They run throughout the academic year, and they're going to end in June, this 2022-2023 year. If you would like any more information about the upcoming sessions or past sessions, you can visit our website, which I will put in the chat. And if you have any questions about this opportunity, you can also email me, that I'll also put in the chat. So each session focuses on a different topic and a certain age range as well. So this is particularly geared toward more high school students. So for today, our session is Climate Justice in New York City. In the session, we're going to be discussing how urban planners and designers had to really think creatively in addressing the challenges and opportunities of local climate change adaptation. And this session will be led by Thaddeus Pawlowski, who is the managing director for the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes, and a research scholar and an adjunct associate professor for the Urban Design and Urban Planning program. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will hand it over to Thad. Oh, and the chat function is disabled, but if you do have any questions, we really encourage you to use the Q&A button. I will be monitoring that Q&A throughout the entire session. So if any questions pop into your head, feel free to use it at any point, and we'll have time at the end to answer those questions. All right, Thad, over to you. Oh, you're muted.
I have to share with audio. Pardon me for not doing that correctly. Share screen, Chrome tab.
Oh, you got muted again.
Strange. Did I unmute?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just try it one more time. I think that there's a trick to advanced sharing options. Who can share? Sorry for the technical difficulty. I'm going to try sharing my entire screen this time and see if that helps. Am I muted?
You are not. Yes.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, but we can.
You see yourself. Okay.
Yes.
How about now? Can you see my?
Yes.
Can you see
my
screen? Okay. All right. So this is working. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay. As Laurel said, I'm Thaddeus Pawlowski. I'm a research scholar and managing director for the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes. And I teach in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, which is one of the graduate schools at Columbia University. I'm an architect by training, but I've worked most of my life and most of my working life in government. I worked in New York City government for about 15 years before coming to Columbia about 5 years ago. So a lot of what I'll talk about today is working in local government, but also working as an architect on climate change adaptation and finding a path toward climate justice in New York City. And there's a global context that's really important to keep in mind. I just went to the big climate convention, the climate talks in Egypt, and all the countries of the world are assembled there to talk about how to limit global warming and to do it really aggressively in order to not get into a really catastrophic situation. We're already seeing catastrophes, climate catastrophes all around the world. But if we keep going as we are with the way that we build cities, then in the way that we manage our economy, then we're going to face more and more climate catastrophes all around the world. And we have to change. We have to change really quickly, and we have to change everywhere, particularly in big cities like New York and what we call the global north or industrialized countries. Because we're responsible for so much of global warming, we're the ones that really need to change the most. And we know here that we can change because we've changed so much in the past. Like 50 years ago, New York City was a really different place. The suburbs around New York City didn't exist, not to the same degree that they do today. There's like an aerial image here of suburbs. That all happened in the last 50 or 60 years, And what's going to happen in the next 50 or 60 years, who knows? But actually, a lot of it is up to us. Like the decisions we make today really define how cities will change in the future. And there's a really important ethical component to thinking about this. Like we have to understand that the decisions that cities like New York make or people in New York make really have effects elsewhere. And particularly the most disadvantaged and vulnerable populations are at the highest risk of the consequences of global warming. This is pretty well understood. It's tragic. We see the floods in Pakistan or disappearing Pacific Island nations or more and more flooding, droughts, heat wave events all over the global south that are disproportionately impacting some of the people that have also been impacted by colonization and neo-colonial economic systems, huge debt burdens, and there's a whole lot of other things that have made these inequalities much more pronounced. So as an urban designer, it's my opinion and also like sort of my call to action that the way we plan and design our infrastructure, how we build cities today is a matter of life and death for our planet and all the communities that depend on our natural systems. So I'm focused on this is like a long phrase here, but climate resilient development pathways. And that means that the way that cities are built basically are like development pathways. Like somebody decides like, okay, we're gonna build a subway and then a skyscraper, and then it just gets repeated like, okay, subway stop, skyscraper, subway stop, skyscraper. We're gonna build a highway and then a bunch of a commercial strip, and then a bunch of single family homes. And then it's like highway, commercial strip, single family homes, again and again and again. There's, you think that building cities would be very creative, but in fact, there are these development pathways that keep getting reiterated again and again. And our development pathways are completely globally premised on fossil fuel consumption, like endless fossil fuel consumption. So we need to change our development pathways to be more climate resilient. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And just a little bit of like our situation here is that I'm working as you heard at Columbia, and we have this center. Our center tries to mobilize the great expanse of knowledge and skills and expertise at Columbia University and other places, and bring it down on the ground in the service of local community leaders who are on the front lines of climate change. And so we've done this in a variety of contexts around the world, in Florida or in Africa, in Belize, a lot of different places, because we've been lucky to form global partnerships with different groups over the last few years. But it's been really important to think about climate change right here in our own hometown. And New York is really lucky that we have a lot of great scientists. A lot of them work at Columbia and the other schools at City College and Rutgers and all the other great schools in the area. And they all get together and they write this New York panel on climate change report. So we have climate projections that are specific to New York City. And it's not good news. It's getting hotter. We're getting more and more heat waves every summer, and more prolonged heat waves. And more heat in the atmosphere leads to more rain, more precipitation. We saw, like in Ida last year, these rain bomb events are like a lot of rain in a short amount of time. And then we also have, with warmer temperatures, expansion of oceans and sea level rise. So we've seen already about a foot of sea level rise in the last century in New York City. And we're expecting a lot more in the future. This one is extremely critical because we have a lot of stuff on the waterfront. We have 580 miles of waterfront in New York City, a lot of waterfront, and we have a lot of houses, buildings, infrastructure, sewer treatment plants, power stations, all kinds of stuff, and parks, a lot of parks on our waterfront. And all of that is imperiled by sea level rise. And that is a slow moving thing. It's been slowly happening, but it's accelerating. And that's kind of a sort of like a fundamental threat to a lot of coastal New York City neighborhoods. It's not just that the sea level's rising too, it's also that like the groundwater, there's water underneath all of our neighborhoods, and that's also rising with sea level rise. And then of course we have hurricanes, coastal storms, tropical storms. You know, we think we're high up in latitude in New York City, but we have gotten some terrible tropical storms, coastal storms, nor'easters, and that activity has been increasing in part because there was like sort of a lull in storm activity for a number of years, and now it's come back, but also with warmer temperatures in the ocean, storms come further north and they gain more power. We had a terrible coastal storm 10 years ago, Hurricane Sandy. Many of you may remember it. And just recently at Columbia, we had like a convening of 500 people from all over the city came together to talk about, it's been 10 years, what have we learned from this whole experience of recovering from Hurricane Sandy? And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as well in the next few slides. And the reason why I'm focused on it, and so many people are focused on it, I mean, it was a really tragic moment, but we always learn from disasters. And this is more or less the definition of resilience, that by facing challenges, we become better. You know, like if you have a really hard test, it kind of forces you to learn more things. And that's true with people, that's true with institutions and with cities to some extent as well, that we learn from each of these successive disasters. New York City has had a really hard, you know, first 22 years of the 21st century, starting with September 11th attacks, when the city really suffered so much tragic loss, but also really tried to reinvest in its identity. And then we suffered from the financial crisis of 2008, which really highlighted to so many people how out of control our economy is, that so many people are getting so stinking rich and so many people are still getting poorer and poorer, and the middle class is shrinking and shrinking. And that's, you know, that's part of the climate crisis too, because that means that more and more people are going to be exposed to climate risk. And then a select group of people are not going to be affected at all and just carry on. And then, you know, we had Hurricane Sandy, which taught us a whole lot of lessons. And for many of us, it was like a wake-up call about the global climate crisis right here at home. And then we had the pandemic, which we're still recovering from. And I think big open question about what we're learning from that whole experience. But I think it has to do a lot with again with the stark inequalities in our society. So also, I'm just going to interweave a little bit of biographical information into this presentation because I have a non-traditional kind of pathway in life, and I think many of our young people today are also going to have non-traditional pathways. Like a lot of us might, start out thinking, like I started out thinking I was going to be an architect, but then I soon, upon like working in the architecture, realized we've got a lot of bigger problems. I love buildings, I love drawing buildings, but we've got sort of bigger problems that I can use the skills of an architect to be a part of the solutions for. And so I was lucky to get a job working for the New York City Office of Emergency Management shortly after graduating from architecture school. And this is a great place to work. They're big thinkers. This is a diagram that they made about all the different risks that New York City faces. Like the police department is New York's finest, and fire department is New York's strongest, and the New York City Office of Emergency Management, they're like New York City's most worried people. Like they worry about everything. And that's good that they're worrying about these things for us. They are thinking about all the different terrible things that can happen in New York City and trying to make plans for them. And what they realize, and what this network diagram is showing, is that all these risks are in many ways intertwined. And so I started to work there back in 2004 on a big map of infrastructure underground. That means New York City is like a very densely built, there's a lot of stuff in a small amount of area in New York City. So stuff's piled on top of each other, and there's a lot of stuff underground, including our whole subway system, or not our whole subway, a lot of our subway system. There's a lot of it that's elevated too. But the subway system, a lot of important parts of it, tunnels, rail yards, other kinds of infrastructure is all underground. And so we were making this big map of underground infrastructure. And at the same time, we got new flood maps from FEMA. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency is responsible for many things, like helping cities like New York recover from storms like Sandy, or they're like down in Florida now and all over the country helping people build back from terrible storms. But they also try to educate communities about their risks to these hazards, and particularly they make these flood maps. But to be honest, they're not very good at it. They're not really great at making flood maps. For one thing, that map on the left, it's very hard to read unless you really know what's going on there. It's almost like they designed the map to sort of obscure the information. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is because people don't like to think about flood risk because it makes property values lower. It makes people nervous. Also, it's complicated. Risk is always complicated. Like they call this a 100-year flood map, and people think like, oh, does that mean that like once every 100 years there's another flood? No, it's not like that. It's all a matter of probability. So it's complicated, but it's also like not super clear in terms of just telling people, hey, there might be a flood here. Take care of yourself, evacuate if you're called to evacuate. So the emergency management people in New York put together their own set of maps to help people understand, like, okay, if a hurricane's coming, then I live in a place where I should evacuate. And that's what this map on the right is. And, it's hard to talk to people about a risk like a hurricane because it's an unhappy thought, but, it's necessary. And because we've had hurricanes in New York City many times in the past, and risk of hurricanes is very high in New York, because the definition of risk from an emergency management perspective is like an equation between how probable something is and what the consequences are. So if something's really probable and really consequential, then that's a very high risk profile. That's something like, flash flooding in New York City has a lot of consequences, and also very common. Heat waves happening every year, very consequential. People really suffer from heat waves. So that's high risk as well. Lower risk would be like, but high consequence, or a lower probability, but high consequence would be something like an earthquake. Very low. We could have an earthquake in New York, not very likely, but if we did, it would be really bad. Anyway, so lower overall risk. In New York City, we have increasing probability of coastal storms and increasing consequence because more and more people live in the waterfront areas. So I was also working at the Office of Emergency Management when this happened. This was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. And it was terrible to see this like major American city just completely flooded, and very weak response from the government to help these people who lost everything. They lost their homes, they lost family members, they lost their communities overnight, and it was a terrible recovery process. Really painful to watch, much more painful to be a part of. But watching from New York, we were thinking, like, oh God, like what if that happened here? What if we lost a lot of housing overnight? Where would people go? And in New Orleans, what happened was about half the population just left, and many of them never came back. And in fact, a lot of the poorest people, the Black population in particular, and New Orleans was such an important part of Black American culture, like jazz and blues, and so much came from New Orleans, and it was like this great mecca for Black culture. And a lot of those people just had to leave because it was the poor neighborhoods that flooded the most, and that the city didn't help and the federal government didn't help. And so they were forced to leave. They were displaced by Hurricane Katrina. Terrible stories, but really beautiful documentary on HBO right now about it, Katrina Babies. And so there were some federal responses, but they were pretty awful, like these trailers here, which had all kinds of toxic materials in them. And they were like on the outskirts of town, and these terrible, like demoralizing situations. Called them FEMA villages, but they weren't villages. They were just like parking lots to store people. Really sad. We did not want that to ever happen in New York City. So I'm an architect, so I put together a design competition to invite architectural solutions to how New York City would recover from a major hurricane like Katrina. And so this is something that we do in climate change adaptation a lot, which is create scenarios. Because in order to anticipate all the things that might happen with climate change and to talk to people about it and start to devise situations, you have to use scenarios. You have to use your imagination to project something that could happen in the future. Because like I said, a lot of climate change effects are happening now, but there's more ahead as we fail to do anything about our global emissions, or do enough. So we created this scenario. We created a fictitious New York City neighborhood that we call Prospect Shore, and we subjected it to a hurricane. And we used that to try to imagine how this neighborhood would recover from a hurricane. And if there was a way to rebuild in such a way that kept people close to home, so they wouldn't be displaced like they were in Katrina, and they could be part of a process, a democratic process, to rethink the way that the neighborhood exists, because we know that with sea level rise, more frequent storms, more heat waves, that there has to be a lot of change in our neighborhoods in order to adapt to climate change. But it's really hard to change. And one of the reasons it's hard to change is because people need places to live. Like after a hurricane, it turns out, is a really bad time to start to really try to make change, because people are stressed out. They're trying to find a safe place to live. So what we proposed here was for FEMA and the city to work together to start to build a lot of housing right after a major disaster like a hurricane. Build housing, build safe housing very quickly that people could live in while the city rebuilds. And then maybe they go back to their housing, their original housing, or if it turns out that it's not a great place to have housing in the first place, maybe they find other permanent housing elsewhere. So that was all work we were doing before Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and then Hurricane Sandy hit the city. It was terrible. It was unevenly felt. Like I said at the beginning, you know, there were a lot of neighborhoods that were disproportionately affected by Hurricane Sandy, and a lot of those were poorer, oftentimes communities of color. And then there were some neighborhoods like Battery Park City here, which, you know, power stayed on and not much changed. They're even though they're waterfront, they're a newer neighborhood and they're built up a little bit higher. But then, yeah, this is an image from down in the Rockaways where there was a lot of terrible destruction. So I worked with a lot of people on big planning efforts. You know, after the disaster like Sandy, you got to rethink a lot of stuff: infrastructure, housing, rules and regulations. The other thing is that we were lucky that the federal government promised to give New York City a lot of money to rebuild after Hurricane Sandy. $18 billion, a lot of money. And that was just, you know, the federal contribution. The city also spent a lot of money, and private developers also spent a lot of money. So I worked on the housing recovery. So there were like 20,000 houses and, you know, homes that were affected by Hurricane Sandy. They were underwater. They lost their, you know, in many ways it was like everybody's basements were flooded, and they lost their utilities. They lost like their hot water heaters, their boilers, their furnaces, their electrical panels. So, and then Hurricane Sandy happened like really late in the year. We just had the anniversary, so it was at the end of October. And so people were living in these houses without any utilities, like right as winter was coming on. And so the city set up this incredible program called Rapid Repairs, where they basically went into all these damaged houses and turned the utilities back on. But they also like sort of cut all the drywall or the sheetrock that where mold would grow, you know, the flooded areas, ripped out anything that mold could grow on, and they just ripped it out, and then, you know, left it like that basically, because it was like it was called a shelter in place program. So this was basically, I was pushing at the time, I was saying we should just build more housing right away for all these people that are displaced by the storm. But this was a quicker, easier thing to do. And this is what we did, the Rapid Repairs program. Some of those same houses then, like a few months later, we got more money from the federal government. And we came back to a lot of those same houses, and over the next few years worked this really complicated program called Build It Back, which is not a great name for a program, by the way. Build it back. We should build it better. We should build it forward. We should build it so that it doesn't flood again, not just build it back. But anyway, Build It Back, like basically went to a lot of these same houses and elevated them. So this is what you need to do to be safe from future storms. There's a few different things generally you can do. You can try to keep the water out, you know, and there's different scales, different ways to keep the water out. Right now, the Army Corps of Engineers is proposing a series of floodgates around the harbor, and a system of seawalls or levees right at the coastal edge that would try to keep the water out. You can also try to keep the water out of a building by building floodgates like right around the building. So that's one way to adapt to flooding. Another way is to get out of there, you know, to what people call managed retreat. And in many cases, this means selling your house to the government and then going to live somewhere else. And that's happening in a few places in New York City and around the country, and it's going to be happening more and more. It's a funny name, managed retreat, because it's not really managed, and retreat is kind of a weird term. But basically, the government buys people's houses. I guess the other thing to do, and what us designers are most, what we mostly think about is how to elevate these buildings, get them out of harm's way. And that's what the Build It Back program mostly did, was elevate these structures to where the water came. And that level of where the water came, it's called the design flood elevation. It's defined by those FEMA maps I showed you earlier, the really complicated maps. Basically tells you how high your house has to be above the flood water. So the Build It Back program elevated about, 3,000 houses all over southern Brooklyn, southern Queens, East Shore Staten Island. And it's complicated work. So there was a lot to learn, and people were really frustrated, as you might imagine. It was like very hard going, like the program, every house is different, but yet there's only so much money. And so there has to be a lot of efficiency in the process. And so there was a real need to create more space for community conversations about how we can work on this together, how we can join forces to really think about our future. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead because I feel like because it isn't just about elevating houses. This is a diagram from I also worked at the New York City Department of City Planning, which is a place where people work on zoning, which is like rules about what you can build where. It has to respect like some of those other rules, like how high the buildings go. But there's also a lot of neighborhood planning that involves thinking about infrastructure, like I was saying, like keeping the water out with coastal protection or seawalls, or building community preparedness, building what we call social infrastructure, ways to bring people together to have conversations about flood risk, about climate change, and about the future of our cities. Of course, we're still facing, this is an image from Ida, we're still facing this damage today. This map on the and every year, we see more and more surprising moments of flash flooding. And recently, this last year, the city put out a stormwater map that basically, like I showed you the flood map, that flood map really is about largely about the flood zones that are created by storm surge and other kinds of coastal flooding. But there's also a lot of flooding from rain. And it's somewhat unpredictable, or it has been unpredictable, less predictable than in urban areas. But the city has a new flood map that's based on, observations about where it tends to flood when there's a lot of rain. And an interesting thing about this flood map is that if you look at it in comparison to what the city looked like 500 years ago, a lot of the places where there tends to be floods are where there used to be streams, where there used to be rivers and natural water systems. And so a lot of the work in climate change adaptation in the future might have to do with restoring those streams and rivers and valleys. So there's also been some big infrastructure projects. I mentioned seawalls. This is like raising the whole East River Park. It's been a really tortured process, a lot of community opposition. Well, first there was a lot of community conversations to try to figure out, okay, we're gonna figure out how to build coastal protection along this park. There were a lot of community meetings, and then there was a big change to the plan, and a lot of people got very upset. So how you do these infrastructure projects are almost important as like what they are, because they can end up creating a lot of distrust between communities and government. And there's so much more work to do ahead. We actually need to go much more the opposite direction. We need to build stronger, trusting relationships between local government and communities as we go forward. So here's another project that came after Hurricane Sandy. This is a project that I think is like kind of indicative of a great path forward. My colleague at Columbia University is this landscape architect named K12, and she and I teach urban design together. And after Hurricane Sandy, her team of landscape architects, SCAPE, they proposed a living breakwater, which is a new kind of living infrastructure. It's infrastructure that's alive off the shore of Staten Island. So there was a time 100 years ago when New York City's waterways had a lot of oysters. They were alive with vibrant sea life, and a lot of that sea life was oysters, which actually these are amazing creatures that actually purify the water. They eat toxins in the water and they make clean water. Kate and her colleagues have been thinking for a long time about how to bring back oysters into New York Harbor and make that part of infrastructure solutions for the city going forward. So what happened on the east shore or the south shore of Staten Island, neighborhoods like Tottenville, during Hurricane Sandy was really tragic. That there were houses that were perched up on hillsides, and when the waves came, it knocked down houses. Like, it caused erosion. You think about erosion, or at least when I hear that word, I think about a very slow process, like water gradually eating away at the shoreline. But it can also happen very rapidly when waves hit a shoreline and erode it very quickly. And so a lot of houses came down and people lost their lives tragically. And so what these living breakwaters will do, and they've just been constructed now, is they will reduce the energy of the wave before it gets to the land, and therefore reduce the amount of erosion that's caused by the waves. And so here's an image of the living breakwater. It becomes not only a way to reduce wave energy, to decrease storm damage, but also to sponsor more vibrant habitat in New York Harbor. And there's already been some seals that have been living on these breakwaters as they go in. So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here to some more recent work. Lately, I've been working on thinking more long-term about climate change adaptation and how different neighborhoods are going to have to adapt in different ways. And I have too many slides here, so I'm just going to jump to the end and say that, you know, like there's a lot of different New York City neighborhoods. Who knows how many? Maybe 120. I don't know. There's like, you know, there's different ways to classify neighborhoods, but there are certain histories of urban development that different places have in common. And that has a lot to do with the way that cities have been built over time. And one of the things that we've realized with climate change adaptation is that it isn't so much about imagining like the great technology that's going to save us all, but in many ways, it's about repairing the damage that's been done by processes of urbanization up to this point. So processes like trying to control nature, you know, trying to put water in a box, trying to limit the natural areas, or even just exploit natural areas for extraction. But it also has parallels with the way that people have been treated over time. And a lot of the ways that people have been treated over time, whether it's been, you know, from slavery into segregation, has created the conditions that'll create this vulnerability to climate change in many of our neighborhoods today. And that's what a lot of the impacts of climate change, they can't be separated from other impacts of environmental racism and environmental injustice in our neighborhoods. So what caused this flood? Is it a failure of infrastructure? Is it climate change? Is it disinvestment? in our poorer neighborhoods. It's all those things that create these floods. And so in order to really adapt to climate change, we have to think about what we've learned over time about taking care of nature and about taking care of each other, and how our democracy, our extension of civil rights and human rights to all people, all those things are important to carry with us as we think about what climate justice looks like in our neighborhood going forward. And so that's just like some sketches I did, but I've been doing this work with young people. Last summer, I was lucky to be joined by 2 young people from area New York City colleges, Tenzin and Annie here. And we ran a series of workshops out in New York City neighborhoods to talk about how climate change is affecting young people in Washington Heights and Red Hook, 2 New York City neighborhoods. That our Washington Heights has really bad heat waves, and Red Hook has terrible flooding and heat waves. And these are 2 neighborhoods that are disproportionately affected by the consequences of climate change. And the young people that are living there know this, and they want to do something about it. And they want to learn more about it in many cases. And they're also the ones that in many ways, like, they're going to be living with climate change much more than I am, because I'm halfway through my life and they're at the beginning of their lives. And so I feel like they take it really seriously and are really motivated for change. So we did these workshops where we basically talked about what climate justice is, what are these different impacts of climate change, and what are some of the solutions that the city is starting to do to address the urban heat island effect, or to mitigate flooding. And then we talked about these histories together, how did it get like this? And how does it affect us today? And what can we do about it as individuals, as communities, and as groups? So I think I'm just about at time. So yeah, in Red Hook, we talked about flooding. We talked about the evolution of flooding and what the city's doing about it, like the evacuation, the interim protection, like putting up sandbags, which is one thing that's going on in Red Hook. They're building temporary protection using sandbags. The city's doing this work, but then later they're going to build a longer term flood protection. They're also in public housing in Red Hook, they're doing this massive project to rebuild all the mechanical systems from public housing. And that process is also really hard on the community because the construction it takes a long time. And the first thing they did was rip out all the trees, which was really, really hard for people, especially because the trees reduce the urban heat island effect. They purify the air, which is already polluted from the industrial area that's all around them. So the trees are another piece of infrastructure. Trees are essential climate adaptation infrastructure. And so I went out with the young people and to talk about what are the costs of these projects and what are the benefits. This is how engineers are always talking about these infrastructure projects. How much are we putting in and what are we getting out? And but it's important to think about these costs and benefits, not just from a dollars and cents from an economic perspective, but from an ecological and social perspective. So as the Army Corps of Engineers gets ready to do more and more of this climate adaptation work in New York City, one of the challenges that communities are facing is how do we get them to think more deeply about the costs and benefits of all these investments? And how do we make sure that the benefits really accrue to the most disadvantaged, the people on the front lines of climate change? So, okay, I'll stop there. Thanks for listening to all that. I'm excited to hear if anybody has any questions or wants to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was really fascinating. I definitely have some questions of my own, but before I kind of jump in, I do see we have one question in the chat right now. So Hannah says, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm curious if you could speak more about the ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, similar to the project you mentioned your colleagues working on. How can these projects affect vulnerable neighborhoods? How can we prepare vulnerable neighborhoods for climate change related hazards in ways that can provide additional services to those communities?
Well, I love that question, and I think it's just phrased so well. And it's like, I feel like that question is also, and Hannah articulated it so well, but it's on lots of people's minds right now, especially as we're, as I mentioned, like we've got this Army Corps of Engineers project, which is like $50 billion potentially. It hasn't been allocated yet, but it could be like $50 billion of money for neighborhoods, to protect neighborhoods from coastal storm surge like we had in Hurricane Sandy. That's it though. Like that's all it will do. Won't do anything about rain, won't do anything about heat. So that's one thing, is like vulnerable neighborhoods face a whole range of risks from climate change. So they really need more than just coastal protection. They need a lot more investment. And thankfully, we also have the Inflation Reduction Act, and we haven't quite seen how that's going to land in our neighborhoods. And then we have this other thing, which is the Biden administration has this Justice 40 promise to disadvantaged communities, that like 40% of federal infrastructure dollars are going to be earmarked for the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. That's all great. Really excited about all of that from a federal level. And we also have more money coming from the state, which is really important too. So, but how we spend that money is so critical. And I think from Hurricane Sandy, like one of the key lessons learned is that we can't just do infrastructure projects the old way anymore. And the old way was basically like Robert Moses. I don't know if people have heard of Robert Moses, but like Robert Moses was this like super city planner, like in the 20th century, early 20th century in New York, that was just like, build a highway there, build housing there, very top down. And that's what made the city what it is today. But we need processes that really empower communities to make their own decisions. And so what I'd love to see is us actually like finding ways to build capacity in neighborhoods to run their own projects through community-based organizations or otherwise, young people, training people from Red Hook or Washington Heights to like, maybe even like through a civilian climate corps or something like that, like similar to AmeriCorps or Teach for America, like actually like recruit people in these neighborhoods to like, and then train them at the climate school or wherever else to run these projects and build careers, build workforce development on the ground in our most disadvantaged neighborhoods to run these projects themselves and build capacity to run these projects all over the country, because actually they're needed everywhere. So to work together with the other frontline communities around the country.
Yeah, that's a brilliant plan. I think empowering young people that are living in these communities and then showing them these career trajectories in this exact area where they can help, the area where they grew up is incredibly powerful and beneficial for people going forward. So we have a few more questions here. Dennis asked, since the pandemic, people are working from home more. Are we seeing that those workers are moving to less risky areas?
Wow. That is a great question, which I don't know the answer to. And I think you, Dennis, just like nailed it, like a really great research question. Maybe you want to take it on and you could get some colleagues of mine at the climate school to join you in that. Like that question, like, are people since the pandemic less likely to move to high risk areas? It's possible. I mean, what we've seen during the pandemic, of course, is like a lot of people fleeing New York, especially like wealthier people fleeing New York. And that's been really hard on the city budget in particular, which just sucks, like the city is losing a lot of very talented people. It's having trouble retaining jobs. It's not good to lose a lot of population for the city. So we don't want that, but we also do want people to make, be empowered to make good choices about where they live. However, very few people, actually have a choice about where they live. It's a privileged position to be able to choose where you live. So yeah, but I wonder, like, just overall trends, like, we're also just like, we are in a deep housing crisis, like, and have been. I think since the beginning of New York City, we've been in housing crisis, but it feels particularly pronounced as wages have stagnated. People are not making more money. Inflation is out of control. Housing prices are out of control. And so we need more housing. And so I think another part of that research question would be like, where are we producing more housing? Are we producing more housing in the places that are lower risk? And is that housing available to the people who need it most? But
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more to talk about there.
Yeah.
People working from home too, as a consequence of the pandemic, I think has other benefits, by the way. Like, I think what we're gonna see, I mean, we are in the industrialized, countries, or like rich places, relatively, like, on average, richer places like New York are, our carbon footprint, like, aggregate, like, went down during pandemic because less travel, less commuting, less and more working at home. So there's an efficiency there, energy efficiency, that I think also deserves further study.
Certainly. If I can make one hypothesis, there was a whole lot of people from the Northeast that moved right down to Florida during the pandemic, which is, especially along the coast, particularly risky, especially, they experienced their first hurricane this fall. So it is interesting how people weigh the costs and benefits of where they're moving to. Like, are they looking for more space? Are they looking to move out of a city where they felt like they're more at risk for the pandemic, or, paradise? But the paradise comes with a whole lot of challenges as well, going forward. So I agree. Very
Yeah,
interesting research topic.
yeah, for sure. We should follow up.
Yeah. And Radhika said, great presentation, makes climate justice come alive. Do you think schools need to have school groups that create their own disaster risk mitigation plans, or at least walking in their own community to see who is at risk and why?
Oh, wow. These are great questions and suggestions. I mean, actually, I don't know that I've ever heard that suggestion before. And it's such a good one, that schools would become the place for disaster risk mitigation plans. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think schools can play enormously important roles in communities in general. And yeah, if they could be empowered or funded through the Office of Emergency Management or otherwise to, like, to create disaster risk mitigation plans, like maybe in collaboration with a community-based organization. The people at Emergency Management have this great new program called Strengthening Communities Together, where they're giving grants to neighborhood groups to create disaster mitigation plans, which is a fantastic program. And maybe a school should apply, or maybe they have, and I don't know about it. I don't actually know who all applied, but that would make a lot of sense. I've been working with a high school in Washington Heights, the Washington Heights Expeditionary Learning School, and they are making up what you could consider a disaster risk mitigation plan. They're proposing to turn the street in front of their school, 182nd Street, into a clean air green corridor, basically taking a street away from cars and trucks and giving it back to people and nature as a way to reduce the urban heat island effect and create a more safe walking zone for kids to get to school, because there's like 4 different schools on that street. So they're in the process. It's like a very student-driven effort. It's also a research effort. It's like a learning opportunity for them. And so more like that would be awesome. And so I really appreciate that suggestion. And maybe you want to check out in your own school, if you're part of the school, or know people who are, make that suggestion. I think it's a great one.
Oh yeah, I love that idea. I work with a lot of high school students that create their own climate action plans, and the creativity around solution-based community action is mind blowing. And so I think if we got more students involved in these disaster risk mitigation plans, some of their creative ideas are probably things that we haven't really thought of. And so kind of taking those and then figuring out how to implement them would be really great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to be involved in that. So lots to follow up on, by the way.
Yes. We do have a couple more minutes, so if there's any more questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A button. So I have a question, I guess, a little bit more specific to the build it back plan. So you had been mentioning that these houses were being raised up. What is the process for that? Is it like physically raising the foundation, or is it like foregoing that first level? It seems challenging.
Yeah, well, it's like, what was funny about that program for me as like an architect was like, hey, like houses are as different as people, you know, like there's no like one single house. Like even if there was, like maybe a builder built like 5 similar houses on the same street, but like, you know, 40 years later, they're completely different. And they have different people living in them who have different desires and expectations. So it's like always totally different. But like a government program wants everything to be the same. But like basically, yeah. So at the beginning of that program was like a very interesting, like professional journey for me and many other people. It was like, okay, we're gonna like make this like, you know, like conveyor belt sort of system where it's like, okay, we send out a surveyor, they figure out what needs to be done, and we give it to a contractor. The contractor figures out the scope, and they go out and do it, and then, you know, we give people the keys and everything's done. There are many more steps, but there's actually like, there was a diagram that was like this crazy pipeline. And then it just turned out that, you know, every house really needed its own set of solutions. I mean, there's rules that can help you like figure it out, but basically like that image I showed, the process for these like small single family homes on lots that are, you know, like separated from their neighbors is you basically like, depending on what the foundation is, most of the time they were like what you call slab on grade, like somebody poured a concrete slab on the ground with like a little bit of a concrete footer around it, not a foundation, but like a footer. And then people would like attach, you know, like build a house on top of that concrete pad. And then so to elevate a house like that, basically you go in and you you know, you cut around the bottom of the house and you brace it, and then you lift it up with jacks, like, you know, like car jacks almost, but like slightly bigger. And then you put it on like wooden cribbing, like you set it down for a moment, like not a moment, usually a few months, like on this, what they call cribbing. It looks like a log it's like 4 little log cabins, like stacked. They're usually wood because you have to kind of adjust it to keep everything level. Okay, and then you go and you demolish the slab and you build a new foundation and you build another, like, and then you put the house back down.
Wow.
And then you build stairs and a porch.
Wow. And
it
so
costs about $300,000.
And the government was paying for this program?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, basically, the way it would work is that if it would take flood insurance, like whatever the payout was for flood insurance, and then use that toward the total amount. But yeah, it was really expensive. And yeah, I mean, it was great for people who got it, but like, it was like a full-time job trying to get through that program. So there was a real kind of equity issue and who got this basically like a windfall of government service versus other people who, especially, you know, rental population, which there's no program that serves rental population like that. So yeah. So I've written a lot about the inequality, the inequities inherent in that program.
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been just like such an amazing session. It's been really fun hearing from you.